Good morning. My name is Jerold Kayden. I'm a professor of urban planning and design here at the Graduate School of Design. And most especially today and last night, co-chair of the Design Competition Conference with David Leer, who is Executive Director of the Van Alen Institute. We're delighted that you're here. We started last night with a very interesting keynote panel with Kathleen McGuigan as moderator and Craig Dykers, Francine Hubin, and Moisin Mustafavi in a very good introduction to this quite complex issue of design competitions. And we'll try to unpack some of that complexity today, hopefully through some framing remarks that I'll make, some news that David Leer and Architectural Record Kathleen McGuigan will make with the announcement of survey results. It's been announced, but David will outline this for us. And then some really interesting panels which will get into the depths of what the issues are with regard to design competitions. 4 case studies this morning, followed by a break. And then the world beyond design competitions. Yes, there is a world of competitions that are not design competitions, but this competition method is used. What can we learn from that? What can that learn from design competitions? And finally, a speculative discussion about the future of the design competition model. It should be a spirited day. We have speakers, we have moderators, their discussions, and then discussions with you, our audience. We view you as colleagues, and we know that you'll participate robustly in making great contributions. There are 2 coffee breaks after the first case study panel, and then in the afternoon as well. Lunch, we're sorry to say you're on your own, but there's the Chow House nearby. So let me introduce David Leer. We'll be doing thank yous for people at the end of the day, it seems to me. We could do them now, David, it's up to you, but we did them last night. But there are other people we very much want to thank, and David, you can decide when.
So I guess we'll do that now. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. We have such a great team, actually 2 teams working on 2 sides of the equation. Here at the GSD, Ben Prosky, Chantel Blakely, and James doing a great job. And I'm so happy to have Jerome Cho and Liz de Wolf on our team. It's really great to work with you. I'm not going to say too much because we'll both be saying a ton today. So let's just get started. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm excited to discuss this very complex topic with you all. So thank you for joining.
So we begin. Design competitions are increasingly used to procure design of, well, just about anything. Competitions appear to be everywhere. Just check out recent experiences in the Boston area. The city of Boston is running or has run in the past year or so a City Hall Plaza design competition, a Living with Water design competition, and a public space design competition. The Boston Design Museum ran its Street Seats competition several years ago. Cambridge, the city, has just completed its Connect Kendall Open Space competition. Here at the Design School, we have 2 competitions, one for Design Miami for a pavilion designed by our students, and another for the street-level space of the Francis Loeb Library right next door, a competition that a class I taught has served as design competition advisor, and midday we'll be announcing the results of that design competition in terms of jury vote and student vote. There is also an affordable housing competition occurring right now for students, and the Urban Land Institute has its urban design competition annually. In short, I think that students here at the Graduate School of Design could give up their studies and educate themselves through participation in design competitions. I'm not recommending that, in part because my salary depends on that not happening. The Boston Globe reported last week that 24 New England choruses will be competing on a new local public television program, which Boston Globe reporter Kathleen Burge described as follows, Quote, "The 36 singers in the Merrimack Valley chorus harmonize. Please don't talk about me when I'm gone. You naughty, naughty minxes, I saw all that shaking," says Jared Bowen, one of 3 judges in Sing That Thing, a new WGBH show that debuts on Fridays. And the costumes, it's like Richard Simmons and Phyllis Diller had a baby. In the United States, one can't watch television without running into Project Runway, American Idol, The Voice, Face Off, The X Factor, Chopped, and at the root of all of it, RuPaul's Drag Race. There's the X Prize and progeny, and the national government's renewed interest in wide-ranging competitions. From museums and opera houses to regional environmental solutions and jetpacks, it's competition world. So are we in a golden era of competitions? Before hyperventilating, let's take a deep breath and recognize that most design in the world occurs without benefit of design competitions. Indeed, most design in the world occurs without benefit of architects and landscape architects, period. In the design world, certainly in the United States, and even abroad for quite a few categories of development, the traditional procurement method of informal shortlist, interviews, and bids dominates the commission of design. Although, of course, in Europe, this is far less true. Still, with its more than occasional use, intrigue, and promise, the competition technique is there to be complemented, criticized, and dissected. The good news is that competitions muster hundreds, if not thousands, of designers to work on a problem. The bad news is that competitions muster hundreds, if not thousands, of designers to work on a problem. At base, then, the questions we must pose are 3. Are design competitions better for design? Are they better for designers? And are they better for the public interest? And better compared to what? So in my framing remarks this morning, I will provide a baseline definition of design competitions, discuss the state of scholarship studying them, delineate some key questions, and finally place on the table some responsive actions. So definition. We certainly have a sophisticated audience here. I can see people who know this field, who are quite familiar with the nature of design competitions. Yet I suspect there are questions, even disagreements, about what elements must exist to call something a design competition. Indeed, I liken it to the Tower of Babel, that great biblical story where God punished everybody who were trying to build a tower to get to the heavens. And the punishment was to make them all speak different languages so they could never collaborate again on a tower to heaven. Well, that's sort of what we have with definitions of design competitions. I think it's important, nonetheless, to agree on a definition, or at least to agree to disagree. I specify 6 elements that are all necessary to call something a design competition. First, a sponsor, a client. Second, individuals and firms that affirmatively enter the competition. It's not just suddenly getting that call at 4 in the morning from Sweden based on work you did 50 years ago when you still could, in fact, do math. So it's not the Nobel Prize, it's not the Pritzker Prize, it's not the Pulitzer Prize for a previous year's work. You affirmatively enter the competition. Third, the production of something that doesn't yet exist. That can be a design idea, that can be a design project. Fourth, a publicly released written brief setting forth the rules of the competition to be followed by the sponsor, the competitors, the jurors, and other participants. As far as I am concerned, the brief is sacred as well as legally binding. It's a contract between sponsor and competitor. And to be clear, in my book, sacred and legally binding are synonymous. I'm also a lawyer. Fifth, a jury of some sort. It can have experts, it can have representatives of the client, it can have members of the public, but there is a formal jury of some sort. And sixth, a public process of some sort. A public announcement that there is a design competition. To me, it's not a design competition if it's all secret. a posting of entries, public presentations to the jury, a public announcement of results. I'm not saying that all of those things are required. I'm saying, however, that they form the criteria for what a design competition, in my definition, is. So if you don't have all 6 elements, I would not call it a design competition. It could be competitive. It could be many other things, but that is different. Now, architect and educator Stan Alen has argued previously that competitions and the traditional procurement process are merging, with second stages involving lots of interviews with the client beginning to mush the things together. And I agree with him, but I still maintain that one needs those 6 elements. Now, there are many other elements that one finds in design competitions worldwide, but to me, none is mandatory for their identity as design competitions. 1 or 2 or 30 stages doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but not for the definition. Anonymous or not, open or invited, public may or may not be involved. Winner does not have to be hired. Winning design or idea does not have to be implemented. There does not have to be a winner at all. Fees are optional. If it doesn't have to be administered by a competition advisor or manager or consultant, I'm sorry to say, Suzanne. It doesn't have to be a technical committee reviewing the proposals or have that. It doesn't have to be blessed by a professional association. It doesn't have to follow regulations specified by public law. Are there best practices? Would I recommend certain approaches over others? You betcha, but that's not part of the bare bones definition. So, agreement upon a definition is important so that debates about design competitions can proceed on the same page rather than arguing past each other. So what about the debates? Well, the biggest point about them is they're not at all new. Competitions have been around literally for centuries, and so have debates about them. I could choose many examples historically, but one of my favorites comes from William Robert Ware, an American architect of the 19th century who sounds right at home in our 21st century discourse. Ware and his firm, Ware & Van Brunt, designed, by the way, Memorial Hall right next to us, and established MIT's and Columbia's schools of architecture. Ware was deeply engaged with debates about design competitions. Let me read you excerpts from 2 obituaries for Ware, one written in the Proceedings of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1917, which describes as follows, quote, "One of the most difficult problems of professional ethics, which American architects have been called upon to solve, has been that of competition among themselves, how to avoid the injustice and the waste of professional time and talent, which is the inevitable result of the informal, unregulated, and uncompensated submission of competitive designs." Very early, the American Institute of Architects, founded in 1857, and its affiliated professional bodies attacked this difficult question. Gradually, for the irregular and demoralizing scramble, which was formerly common, if not usual, has come to be substituted the formal paid competition, subject to definite rules, controlled by a professional advisor, and impartially decided by this advisor or in its later form by a professional jury. The submission of competitive sketches under other conditions is now regarded as unprofessional. In the development and gradual improvement of this scheme, Professor Ware's good judgment, far-sighted wisdom, and absolute and universally recognized impartiality was invaluable. And another obituary written by Hamlin of Columbia University describes Ware as, quote, "one of the first and most persistent agitators for the reform of architectural competitions, and conducted or was an advisor for a greater number of these than any other architect, especially during the period 1880 to 1900. In these labors, he contributed not only to the reform of the procedure and conduct of competitions, but also to the education of architects and public alike in those ethical profession principles, the disregard of which has given rise to so many notorious scandals. On 1 or 2 occasions, his open-hearted trust in the fundamental honesty of mankind was imposed upon, to his infinite surprise and grief. But in general, he was eminently successful, and it is safe to say that it was he who laid the foundations upon which the American Institute of Architects has built up its efficient regulation of competition practice. Professor Ware, where are you now? One of the surprising features of the modern era of design competitions is the relative absence of rigorous research about the benefits and costs of design competitions. Scholar Alen Lipstadt laments the lack of information and research about competitions in the United States. She asks, but cannot answer, do they achieve design excellence? Is there a correlation of competitions with innovation and the discovery of new talent? We still have an inadequate amount of base data and analysis for evaluating design competitions. For example, we have no comprehensive, accurate information about the number of competitions and the chances of winning, the costs individually and across the board associated with competing, the number of buildings built out of design competitions, the quality of design produced in design competitions, the effect upon individual design practices and the profession, and so on. Most of our information about design competitions is, let's face it, anecdotal, war stories. Was it good for you? There are the ultimate success stories, repeated again and again. Maya Lin, out of nowhere, to a career-making win. Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, who were they before the Pompidou Center Commission? There are the amusing stories, Corbusier's attempt to skirt the anonymous submission rules for the League of Nations building competition by inserting an image of himself in the drawings and a crow which represented Corbusier in the drawings. Followed by his lawsuit later on when he lost against the League for a copyright violation when he thought that Henri-Paul Naneau, who won, had borrowed elements from his submission. There is the wisdom for the ages, Greg Pasquarelli of Shop. We challenged the program and won. We always need to know who is on the jury or we won't enter. Mel Krul, the Dutch architect, describing the Media City Port project in Hamburg, where the height limit was 80 meters and ours was 120. So we broke the rules and could have been turned out. We worked it all out, we won, and then the landowner next door got Herzog and de Meuron for the Philharmonic on the same spot, and that took over and killed the project. Describing the National Academy for the Arts in Norway, halfway through, images got out on the internet, says Krul, and there was voting. Snoetta and Craig Dykers were winning, so we pulled out. Craig isn't here to hear that. We do have admirable resources that provide some data, case studies to be sure, and even some useful critique. David Vanderleer will indeed shortly shed new, more comprehensive light from the results of a very good survey conducted by Van Alen and Architectural Record, and that's all to the good. I think of the Canadian Competitions Catalog, an online library created in 2002 by researchers Jean-Pierre Chupin, Denis Bilodeau, and Charles Adamczyk at the Laboratoire d'études de l'architecture potentielle of Canadian Design Competitions. The American website Competitions that G. Stanley Collier has been putting together over the years, and its annual publications provide some case studies of American competitions. On the more academic front, there's the Princeton Conference almost a decade ago entitled The Politics of Design, Competitions for Public Projects, edited by Catherine Malberg with Elaine Lipstadt's very good opening essay based on her review of 206 competitions from 1991 to 2004, profiled in Competitions magazine. Architecture Competitions, Histories and Practice, edited by Anderson, Zettersten, and Ron, is useful about Europe. A new book just out, Architecture Competitions and the Production of Culture, Quality, and Knowledge, an international inquiry, edited by Chupin, Cucuzella, and Helal, is, I think, a particularly good addition to the literature. Jack Nassar's Design by Competition, Making Design Competition Work, is very, very useful, particularly with regard to how juries function and should make decisions. And we have such chestnuts as Catherine Solomonson's The Chicago Tribune Tower Competition, Skyscraper Design and Cultural Change in the 1920s, great reading. And Stanley Tigerman's much later 1980 riff on the competition, the Chicago Tribune Tower Competition, and late entries, the late entries being years after the competition was actually conducted, and they ran another competition for it, even though it wasn't meaningful in the real sense. There are films out there. You must see The Competition, a 2013 film directed by Angel Borrego Cubera, and starring Jean Nouvel, Frank Gehry, and Meryl Streep as Zaha Hadid. Really incredible impersonation by her. Well, I'm just kidding. It's really Zaha Hadid. By the way, Nouvel, it's shocking, plays a very grumpy Jean Nouvel. The Sandcastle of 2007 about a quest by His Highness Sheikh Saud of the United Arab Emirates to invent a new capital city through a competition with Snøhetta among the competitors. The Royal Institute of British Architects puts out videos advertising their shop as a design competition advisor. The web itself and Google searches are among the best resources out there, albeit undigested, listing literally thousands of design competition websites with briefs and entries posted, a veritable treasure waiting to be mined. And then there are lots of journalistic opinion pieces in the various architectural journals, mostly criticizing the design competition model. So there is some stuff out there. I think it's undercooked, but it does give us something, and it certainly helps us to ask the key questions, or the big questions, with regard to this. And yes, questions to be answered, analysis to be conducted, proposals to be put forth, all with incomplete information, fine. Because there are design competitions, and there are design competitions, two different things, our answers will vary greatly depending on how a given single design competition is set up and administered. But the uber question persists. Are design competitions a better way to procure design, ideas, projects, designers, compared with other design procurement methods? It must be compared with traditional procurement or other methods in order to come up with some sort of answer. Now, within this uber question, let me articulate 6 sub-questions. First, do design competitions serve the interests of individual designers? What do we mean by interests? Well, there's direct compensation for the outlay of time and other resources. You could, for example, take the value of the commission that you would get if you were to win, multiplied by the probability of winning. That will greatly discount, by the way, that financial interest. You could take the monetary award even without actual commission, multiply that by the probability of winning. Maybe there's participation fees, maybe not. There's indirect compensation derived from getting publicity, a form of marketing to attract future clients, and we could attribute that future revenue to entering a given competition. There are other financial, non-financial interests for architects and landscape architects and other designers. Keeping colleagues in the firm excited and creative, even yourself, especially in downtimes. Lipstadt suggests that design competitions present an opportunity for a creation unfettered by client control, reaffirming the designer's social identity as a cultural producer. This is something actually that Mohsen Mustafavi was addressing last night, especially with regard to open competitions. Competitions give designers an opportunity to move to the next personal level of design skill, so the very act of entering is the win, regardless of whether the person actually wins. All right, that's question number 1. Do they serve the interests of individual designers? 2, do competitions strengthen or weaken the design professions? Imagine if lawyers did this. Actually, I can't imagine it. Hundreds of lawyers draft a legal brief, the client selects a winner, and doesn't pay the other lawyers. Not going to happen. Do competitions make for better business outcomes for the design professions? Thousands of designers working for free? Very, very interesting. Competitions can unearth new ideas and talent that elevates the profession so that more clients turn to the profession. Indeed, Stan Alen has argued that competitions drive the profession of architecture forward, individually and collectively. But is this good for business? Open competition surely can unearth new talent and be removed from the strictures of the client. But again, does this strengthen or weaken the profession as a whole? Competitions can educate the public about design so they appreciate design more. Well, that's interesting. Competitions, however, can degrade or demoralize the profession, showing a desperation for work and thus working under conditions that really violate basic standards of labor practice. Third, do specific design projects or ideas benefit from design competitions, the actual projects of ideas? Do competitions improve the quality of project design or generate more or better ideas? Is there truly a freedom to innovate greater than direct contact with client, more ideas, input of the jurors to push the proposals forward? Do competitive forces themselves affect the production of design in ways similar to the effect of competitive forces on production in other areas, or at least the claimed effect of competition? Competitive tenders and RFPs versus no-bid contracts. Does that competition really generate something that's better? Certainly, we believe lower prices, but are we looking for lower prices here or better design? Fourth, is the public interest enhanced by design competitions? Do competitions enhance excellence in the production of the built and natural environment? Better outcomes, a lot more ideas, a better educated public that cares more, perhaps a sponsor that thinks more carefully about his or her vision. There's the input of the jury. Do competitions make for a more democratic outcome, thereby advancing the public interest? If the public is involved more in the process, then perhaps media coverage, maybe. Do competitions reduce corruption? That's one of their original purposes, rooting out corruption or nepotism or incompetence by selecting on the basis of merit. They can produce a resource of briefs and proposals and entries that can be used in the future. That advances the public interest. Quickly, fifth and sixth, do design competitions represent an uncommonly flexible and innovative process for solving problems? And many people praise the design competition model for mashing together different disciplines and groups to solve a problem, particularly in recent times. We'll hear about that with Rebuild by Design. But you could have a process, let's call it an interdisciplinary public participation process in which these things occur, and it's not a design competition process at all. Finally, sixth, are competitions ethical? Are they exploitative, even the best-run ones? Exploitative, by the way, is defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary as unfairly or cynically using another person or group for profit or advantage. There's a huge amount of uncompensated labor provided, hundreds of people spending thousands of hours without any compensation. There may be misappropriation of ideas by sponsors. Competitions may be unfairly run, wired from the get-go. And should the fact that designers are not forced to enter design competitions affect our judgment about the ethics of design competitions? I will mention that in law, there are legal agreements voluntarily entered into, allegedly, that nonetheless we simply do not allow, even with this voluntariness, allegedly nominal voluntariness of both parties, because they are unconscionable agreements or they're against public policy. Okay, future actions, and I close. Lipstadt proposes to design intelligent design competitions. And raise your hand high if you believe we should have intelligent design competitions. I think that's great. It's worthy of a full day's conference, and we're going to have it, and more. But even if we agree on those components, how do we persuade sponsors and competitors to make that happen? Let me suggest three quick things. How about codes of principles, codes of conduct, models of conduct? Designers should decline to participate in design competitions that fail to meet specified principles. And we'll argue over those principles. But the code, now that sounds very aspirational, but the code could be drafted, promoted, and even enforced in numerous ways. We need to consider the roles of design institutions, the professional associations, the licensing bodies, the academic institutions, the accreditation bodies, the nonprofits like Van Alen, and maybe a specially formed task force. So what should be the role, if any, of professional associations like the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the American Planning Association? The AIA, by the way, has a design competitions handbook, which, quite frankly, is a toothless affair that seems to be as much concerned about the client as the designer, and moreover, largely ignores the public. The AIA does have its code of ethics and professional conduct. It has created a model contract dealing with contracts between clients and architects. How about a model design competition brief, or several of them out there? And I wouldn't worry too much about antitrust violations. One hears a lot about that. I don't think that's the issue. The Royal Institute of British Architects is robustly engaged with design competitions to the point where it actually runs a lot of them, and I have to assume generates significant revenue for its operations in ways that, by the way, in my view, raise conflicts of interest. The Architects' Council of Europe, representing professional architects organizations in the member states of the European Union and the interests of 550,000 European architects, has adopted rules for architectural competitions for their members through its General Assembly in 2014. What about the role of state licensing bodies? There's the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards in the United States representing all of the state licensing bodies. Accreditation bodies for educational institutions. The National Architectural Accrediting Board could require the teaching about design competitions and their ethics and principles for participation. The banding together of academic institutions, making a case for when to participate and not. What's a good design competition? How do we use this model effectively to advance the public interest, the profession, and individuals? New or old, not-for-profit, making the case. A task force with model codes. Laws, yes, the European Union and European countries have laws. We have some laws. I don't know that that's finally the answer. And of course, we have to have a cultural agreement among architects, sponsors, and others, but it's doubtful that that would hold. I would finally suggest engagement by the Academy and the creation of an enduring archive, a publicly accessible record of all competitions and their entries, available publicly, but protecting the intellectual property rights of the creators. So, it's a heavy agenda that we have, and I'm excited to hear from all of you about where we may take this interesting mechanism for procuring design. Let's now hear from David van der Leer, co-chair of this conference, about what all of you actually think about design competitions, and thereby begin to assemble more knowledge that can actually move us forward in thinking about and acting upon design competitions. Thank you very much.
What you may not know about Jerold is that he's also a composer. But what I didn't expect is that Jerold can also rap about design competitions. That was great. Thank you very much. Good. I want to tell you a little bit about Van Alen before I get started with the data of our survey. We have been making design competitions for the past 120 years. A very long time, basically since our Beaux-Arts days. And some of our projects you will know. In the mid-90s, we were the first ones highlighting the potential of Governors Island as a public space for New York City. And we all know where this headed. There's actually a fantastic park opening right now. And we were the ones behind the red steps on Times Square. These days, we have projects that basically sit between these two scales. On the one side, you see small design projects for public space interventions, often temporary. And then on the other side, you see very, very big landscape projects in which we're rethinking what could be happening in the landscapes of the future of the US. And what you see here on the right is the delta for the Mississippi, a very rapidly changing delta that really needs to be dealt with. Increasingly in our projects, we try to draw in the stakeholders, the general public, and we do this in creative ways. And we'll talk more about Rebuild by Design today, but here on the left you see one of our stakeholder workshops. Not necessarily at a drawing table with post-its and so on, but on bikes and just having a fun afternoon. And on the right you do see a fairly straightforward workshop, also those we run. And in this case we're drawing people into the process that we run in New Orleans for a vacancy project. 10 years ago, almost to the day actually, we ran a similar conference as this conference today. And the focus was the politics of design. We ran this together with Princeton University Policy Research Institute. And it was an important conference because we were really trying to figure out, okay, what is the political landscape that these competitions take place in? As Jerold mentions, one of the problems with this topic is that it's fairly anecdotal. So also that conference was highly anecdotal, interesting content. Actually, some of the Alen Lipset references come from that conference. And we realized if we do a new conference, we should think about this a little bit further and see if we can get some data into the topic. So together with Architectural Record, a few months ago, and thank you, Kathleen, for working on this with us, we launched this design competition survey. It was focused on designers around the world And it's not always easy to get designers to focus because everybody's too busy working basically 25 hours a day. So we threw in some prizes that made some people very happy and some other people look still a little grumpy after receiving them. But nevertheless, we got to over 1,400 responses from 65 countries around the world. Gave us a decent sense of what we could be saying about design competitions. We asked them data or questions that could be translated into data. But at the end of the survey, we also left some space for what we all know we like, the actual anecdotes. And Jerold had his nice reference to the law practice, but actually one of our participants in the survey compares it to plumbing jobs. You're not farming out your plumbing jobs through competition either. So yes, and was interesting to see to us because designers also have very good humor. 2 jokes on 1 page. What we did with our survey is basically look at where could this go, and we turn it into a series of propositions. And these propositions I will run through in this presentation today. Sometimes a little longer, sometimes pretty short. One of the first things to highlight is that there was often a limitation to entering competitions. And that is pretty straightforward. It's often just a lack of compensation. We all know that in competitions you don't make enough. And this is actually quite interesting to see. A little over 10%, almost 11% of the firms that are participating in competitions spend more than $100,000 on a given competition. Some of these spend more than $250,000 on these competitions. These are big numbers that are rarely paid back by the competition fees. Of course, you could question, like, okay, is it a good business model? Is it smart? I think those are bigger questions. Perhaps we get to some of those today. But it leads us to at least our first proposition, which is about what should we do with the value of these designs generated. And we really feel strongly that they should be, the value should be shown. Why can we not ask designers to just track the hours that they're making on these competitions? It's not so difficult. It will just take you a little bit more time that you already don't have. Track the time, and then what we could do with it is show this as an aggregate and show the communities, show the clients all the free work that is being done. Not only to show that it's free, but also that there's a very committed group of people out there, designers, who want to improve everyday life for people around us. Another limitation to entering is the low probability of winning. And that's always a tricky thing when you're participating in a competition. But then on the other side, what you see is that many people do participate, even though they know that they cannot really win in many cases, just because they think, oh, well, there may actually be an opportunity to gain visibility. Makes total sense. But then in competitions, it's so rarely that you actually have that opportunity. So we feel that as a design field, as a field of organizers of competitions, we should go beyond promoting only the winners. We should take some time out and really promote also all of these other design proposals that are sitting in these mixes. They're often very good and for a variety of reasons are not getting through the selection process. So let's show these in books, in exhibitions, in press, and not only focus on the winners. Then, and this is fairly logical, but important to mention, many people feel it's a limitation to enter because the jury process is often highly subjective. And yes, it is. I've been in art juries, I must say. So what should we do with that? It's actually very important to be sure that the jury should speak up, not only during the design process, but especially after. It's so rarely that you get to see the jury comments, and why not show those? I think it would be a great thing, and it would also probably mean that the jury is getting a little less subjective and try and really stay on topic during the jury deliberations. Could be very interesting. Then the last limitation to entering is the very low chances of implementation. And that is an important thing to note, especially for public buildings, especially for cultural buildings. What you often see is that the competition is only a starting point of a process, often a starting point of a fundraising process, and it doesn't always lead to implementation. What we learned is that some of the most popular topics in competitions, or the most popular competitions, were these four. And I think most of you will actually recognize most of them. Top, you see the World Trade Center Memorial Competition, and we take this as a break. Then on the top right, you see Rebuild by Design, the big proposal to protect southern Manhattan. Then the Helsinki project for the Guggenheim, which we'll be talking about extensively today. And then on the right, you see the Highline competition. And as an anecdote, actually, that was one of the competitions that Alen kindly declined when people came to us to organize it, because we weren't entirely sure if it was going to be interesting. I think there was a little mistake. Nevertheless, to make another jump, and this is, I find very fascinating. This is often how people perceive design competitions on the outside, or they perceive the design field. So when designers participate in a competition, this is what the outside world believes is happening. Designers don't interact with the client or the public. They will never visit the site because Google Earth is a fantastic tool, and you just need to produce mind-blowing renderings. It's just all that is needed. Well, that's not necessarily the case. But the problem with this is that clients have also started believing this is how design is working. So we would suggest that instead of making them believe this, is actually we should show clients the way and tell them what really should happen in a design process. However many stages you choose, we feel it's quite important to make a shortlist selection. From the shortlist selection, start a very, very strict and serious, sometimes also fun, process in which you expose the designers to the clients, to the stakeholders, and so on. And that should be a process how you work with designers, and not this hands-off process that people have started to believe is design. Then many designers often complain that they're not collaborating with other fields. And also in our survey, this became quite clear. So actually 46% of the designers said they rarely work with others. And a small percentage actually did say that they work with others. And it is the most amazing way to get to good content, to really reinvent what you're working on by working with completely different disciplines. So instead of spending many lonely nights trying to figure out what is the right solution for a topic, let's just open this up and be sure that we collaborate with other disciplines. And that sits on different levels. So we spoke about it, or I spoke about the jury already, but it's also important to draw others into this process from the beginning. You have the users, you have the advocates, you have the policymakers, and so on. But can they be part of the design process? Can they be part of the competitions from basically day one? So make it public. Pull all of these people into the writing of the brief. Make sure that they're involved constantly throughout the process. And sometimes this can be in fairly lighthearted ways. There's one person in this room or 3 people in this room that remember this session. This was Ashbury Park for Rebuild by Design. And here we worked with many of the stakeholders in pulling in potential other stakeholders. And this looks totally silly, but it was a very, very effective parade. And yes, they did start following the process. Good. Among some other of the top reasons for entering competitions are, of course, the opportunity to experiment and to work through interesting issues. As Jerold also mentioned, in many design cases, you're working with a client that sometimes just wants a good office floor, and that's it. But as a designer, you're a highly intelligent person, you're creative, and you want to be challenged every once in a while. So how can we make sure that happens? And especially with young designers, we feel that is a big issue that we need to be much more serious about. Young designers complain, and sometimes also in the funniest ways, about the attention for competitions often only going to this top level of the Renzos and the Zahas, with lots of Z's in this case. Must be a young student overworked in the middle of the night. But many of the students actually would love to be involved because they see it as a way to somehow be seen for the first time, as Jerold mentioned, the example of Rogers and piano, for instance, but also to address topics that otherwise they cannot discuss so easily, and to really work through, what could be a challenge to conventional thinking. And the great thing about a survey like this is that we could also ask people what would be topics that you would like to work about, if it's not through giant buildings, for instance. And that's actually quite eye-opening. This was especially the younger crowd in the survey that was saying these things. But as you see here, it's not about fancy big museum buildings, but people are actually interested in covering very serious topics. What can we do about racial segregation? What can we do about creating more cooperative land models for the US? What is the future of healthcare? So these are serious topics. Leading me to basically my last point is we should think much bigger. Design competitions have a huge potential. Designers are probably one of the most enthusiastic, optimistic fields. So let's really use that to our advantage. And of course, I'm mainly or preaching to the choir and speaking to myself. Because what can we do as an organization in this case? Van Alen Institute, having organized hundreds of competitions, we should also make this better. So, just as a learning process, coming out of this initial survey with designers, we feel that we need to up our fees, very straightforward. And we actually almost always are able to pay fees. That's already a good start. But it's important to be sure that these fees go up so that people can actually spend serious time on their work for the topic. Then also, let's be sure that there is feedback going back to the designers. It's such a shame to just leave people hanging at the end of a process, even though there's sometimes so much to be learned from the jury deliberations, and sometimes in an informal way that can happen. So these are just two little things that we want to work on in the future. If you've counted, I forgot one number. That was actually number 4. And that's, of course, a nice thing. Designers are very smart, very creative. And we feel that we cannot just do this on our own. Rethinking the design competition is something that we'll be working through today. But it's also something that we would like to do with all of you. So hopefully over the coming months, over the coming years, we can draw on you, count on you, to help us rethink what would be an interesting scenario for the future, an interesting scenario for design competitions. The last thing on the level of the survey, this was an initial survey among designers, but it's of course only one part of the mix. There's other surveys that need to be done, and over coffee already interesting things happened this morning. Perhaps this should be surveys among city officials. God knows, we may need to speak to developers. There's all of these other fields that we'll need to draw in to really understand better what this picture is. But I'm happy that at least we made a small jump in pushing the anecdotal into some information that is actually measurable on the level of design competitions. And no, we haven't resolved everything yet, but let's see what we're getting to. So thank you for joining today. I hope we have lots of good discussions, and over to, I think, coffee, is that right? No, I will go over to Reed. Good, thank you.
I don't know, not as good as coffee, but I think I've got more interesting things to introduce you to. And that's going to begin with our first panelists, who are let me do these in alphabetical order. Marshall Brown, the guide will tell you a little bit more about Marshall, but it doesn't tell you that he is, in addition to being a professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology, also an important young working urbanist, although I guess we don't have that degree here. Marshall's practice, architectural practice, and his writing and research involves a great deal to do with urban issues well beyond simple design and building design. And Kara Kayden, who is with us today, a new employee of the Rockwell Group, but previously at both Frank Gehry's office and the Guggenheim, and I think it's her time at the Guggenheim that we're going to be most interested in talking about today, where she was in charge of the project, the Helsinki competition. So would you please help me welcome both of them? We're going to have talks from each of them. And Marshall, I believe, is first. Is that right? Kara's first. Okay, so alphabetically inverted. We'll begin with Kara, then we'll have a talk from Marshall. Then the three of us will come up on stage together, and that sets the pattern for the rest of the day for each of our in-depth case review projects. So, Kara.
Good morning. Let's see, how does this work? As Reed said, I'm currently a studio leader. I run a design studio at Rockwell Group, but previously I was the director of architectural projects at the Guggenheim, overseeing Abu Dhabi and Helsinki. So the Helsinki design competition is something I was intimately involved with, and I have run into familiar faces who I interfaced with during the process of figuring out how the design competition would work. So I wanted to start first with a video that was produced in Madrid, Spain, but it's actually about the Guggenheim Helsinki project, and I think it captures a lot of the controversy, notoriety, and also benefits of doing this type of competition. It was not produced by the Guggenheim. We found it online.
For over 75 years, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation has been breaking barriers in the promotion of visual culture. Its 3 museums in New York, Venice, and Bilbao have changed the architectural conception the world over. And before laying even the first stone, Guggenheim Helsinki is already reforming the landscape of international design through the colossal volume of project submissions it's received. But when we say colossal, how do we put that into perspective? Let's start with an individual submission. Each design submission required 2 A4-sized pages, 4 A1-sized boards, and 1 USB containing the project in its entirety. A relatively reasonable amount of work, no? But with a record-breaking 1,715 submissions, we have 6,860 A1-sized boards, each individually measuring 841 millimeters tall and 594 millimeters wide. That spread horizontally would reach a total length of over 4,000 meters, which would take an average adult man more than an hour to walk. Arranged vertically, it'd be 5,769 meters tall, or higher than all of the mountains in Europe. And if spread across the surface, it'd be nearly 3,500 meters squared, filling over 3 Olympic swimming pools. Even piling the boards on top of one another would be taller than 6 giraffes, and they'd weigh almost 3,000 kilograms, about the same as a delivery van. But what about the time that you guys need to invest? Let's assume the judges dedicate 5 minutes to every project. That would mean the judges would end up spending 8,500 minutes together, or 142 hours, nearly 18 days. If we add to that the 47.5 hours it would simply take to read each concept description, it would take about a month working 8-hour days to get through everything. Let's hope the judges all get along. And if we want to talk about money, taking an ideal architectural team with a senior architect, 2 juniors, and an intern working for a month on their proposal, and using average salaries from the Royal Institute of British Architects, we'd be looking at an amount of work valued at over 10,000 euros. If we multiply that by all the submissions received, Guggenheim is sitting on over 18 million euros worth of work. This collective effort is colossal. It is historic. It shows the tendencies and the importance of design in the 21st century. But this historic moment for the Guggenheim Foundation and for the world of design, for the time being, is just that, numbers, albeit incredible. It should be documented. These are incredible figures that show the impact that the Guggenheim Foundation has throughout the world. They reflect the success that the foundation has had. Guggenheim should document this to recognize their success in helping shape a global community dedicated to visual culture. And if you all think so too, we've got plenty more good ideas to share.
So, like I said, I rather than start off with, all the benefits, it's sort of a great introduction to kind of the notoriety of the competition. At the same time, I would say at the Guggenheim, we were extremely proud of our accomplishments, the amount of submissions, and I think, much of what David spoke about resonates very much with me. And I think one of the things that distinguished the Guggenheim Helsinki competition is that the Guggenheim is a high-profile educational arts institution. It's very much, my background's with Frank Gehry, and I worked with him right after Bilbao opened. So I actually watched kind of the meteorite, the big rise to fame of a Starchitect. So I feel like there's a certain kind of optimism I have about what is possible because I've been next to it. The fact that the competition was open and anonymous was something that was both mandated by the Finnish government, but also something I felt quite passionate about. I also really wanted the competition to be open to anyone with a degree, not just registered architects. In my experience, both working professionally, working at the Guggenheim, a lot of the most creative people aren't registered, and sometimes registered architects are the most conventional. So to kind of have it as an idea, design-oriented opportunity, that was important. And then one thing that the Guggenheim's been amazing about is sharing all the data with the public and processing it, making it something that's accessible and something that people can learn from. And then obviously the controversial areas, unpaid work. I think in particular there was a perceived beauty contest with the Guggenheim Helsinki, which I'll get into in a little bit, and just an oversimplification of the design process. So again, my background, I went to Yale. Frank Gehry was my professor there. I worked for him for 10 years, had a very close relationship. And I think some of this just goes to show how close I am to this experience of a building changing somebody's life. Because once I left Frank, I was hired by Tom Krenz, who also has a very ambitious view of the world and was involved with the expansion of the Guggenheim. And then reported to Juan Ignacio Vidarte in my role as director, and he is the director of Bilbao, and the three of them were kind of instrumental to making Bilbao happen. So again, to me, the possibility of actually a life-changing building is real. There you see them at the opening. But meanwhile, I'd say my upbringing, I was brought up around a lot of more homogeneous looking buildings, which I think has led to me to be an idealist about architecture. And I love the idea that these kind of whimsical buildings and things can happen, and I'm really interested in supporting that in people. And one of the things that motivates me is difference. So, having something that is original, that tells a child that they can be different, that's a beautiful thing. So for me, the fact that this could unearth emerging talent was super important. I was opposed to having the good old boys. I feel like that was something that Tom Krenz did a lot of in the past, where he actually we did feasibility studies for Guggenheims, and design would be correlated with that. I didn't want that. The fact that, and David talked about this, that this gives an opportunity for architects to break out of their box and explore a new program type. In many forums where we had feedback, that was something that came back frequently, was doing a museum project is not something that a lot of architects get the chance to do, and this gave them that opportunity. One of the questions that had come up was an RFQ when we hired our museum consultant, competition consultant, Malcolm Reading, who administered the competition. And it seemed immediately to me he wanted to do something that was about the qualifications, and I was concerned about that in terms of limiting the talent. So we're global. Our mission statement involves architecture, which I think makes us unique and draws more potential competitors. For me, the change to Richard and also David Vanderleer, who we were colleagues at the Guggenheim, led to some really innovative architectural programming, which encouraged me that a competition run by the Guggenheim would be not just a beauty contest, but actually something that was engaging in the urban issues. So there was still spotting that was part of David's work, and then there's also the B&W Guggenheim Lab that was designed by Atelier Bow Wow, and very well received and innovative project. One of the things for me about programming within the Guggenheim is, okay, architecture's part of it, but I don't believe that architecture actually exhibits well within spaces. I think you need to experience it to see it. Background of the competition, we did feasibility studies, as I mentioned. In the past, a building was associated with it. For this, there was heavy involvement with the Finnish government. There was a lot of acknowledgement of the role of Finns in architecture. As I mentioned, Malcolm Reading was the administrator of it. We had a variety of dates in terms of the launch of the competition. The selection of the jury was certainly key, and how the jury ran Mark Wigley made a huge difference in terms of what was focused on. And as David said, one of the things that was least focused on were renderings, which I think made the initial launch of the online gallery confusing because it only showed images, whereas there were the 4 panels that showed the actual architecture of the work. So it seemed as though there was, and we also had this feature where you could act like the jury, but no one had the context of the actual work. So this is an example of one of the images and one of the finalists, but there was 4 panels behind each work. All of the work has been made public through GitHub. There's an exhibition that opened last night in Helsinki. All of the data has been analyzed. So for me, the controversy, I feel like any of these projects that I've worked on in my career, nothing happens without some controversy. And that just kind of sums it up. I think for me, on the computational side, I land as an idealist.
Morning, everyone. To say I graduated from here 15 years ago. It's very exciting to be standing behind this podium for the first time. And after I've finished today, maybe be the last time. And I still feel very connected in many ways. You know, I'm an educator now, an architectural educator now, and I still feel very connected in many ways to the students. So, and one of the things I think about a lot is that this kind of, student-teacher relationship lasts for a very short moment, and then we all become colleagues. So collegiality is a little bit where my remarks will be directed towards today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a letter that I've written to the finalists of the competition in question. April 24th, 2015, to the GHDC finalists regarding Endgame. My dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to extend sincere congratulations for your recent achievements and the recognition it has brought to your practices. I suppose you may be wondering about the cause for this letter since, at least that I can recall, we've never formally met. Put simply, I was asked to speak at this week's design competition conference at Harvard and comment on your contest in Helsinki. This is a peculiar assignment for me because 1 year ago I wrote an essay for the Architects newspaper that criticized the current state of architectural competitions. It concluded with the melodramatic, yet also sincere invitation for like-minded architects to join me in, quote, early, complete, and permanent retirement, end quote, from such contests. In the meantime, I've managed to follow through on my retreat from the design competition industry, despite several invitations from colleagues to collaborate, though there was a recent and regretful re-engagement, which I will describe at the end of this letter. Though I willfully agreed to participate in this conference, I also now find myself troubled by the prospect of helping to promote just the sort of spectacle which I previously denounced. To be honest, I've not been following news of your current contest, and the past year has left me with little time or interest in keeping up with the happenings in the competition industry. Nonetheless, feelings of duty to the conference organizers have left me burdened with the responsibility of addressing your contest directly. Recognizing this dilemma, I conceived this letter as a way of hopefully avoiding a trap, but also speaking productively to certain issues which may be at stake. Instead of speaking negatively about the contest, the quote-unquote client, the organizers, the jury, the proposals, or the participants, I would like to speak to you, the finalists, in hope that some of us might grow in the process, or at the very least, avoid undermining each other in the ways that architects often do. My understanding and experience of design competitions come from the American context. In 2009, I worked briefly with J. Max Bond, David Adjaye, and Phil Freelon on the competition for the National Museum of African American History until Max Bond's untimely passing, after which I withdrew from the project. In 2012, my team was a finalist in the Navy Pier Centennial competition in Chicago, after which I did some consulting work with the winners, James Corner Field Operations. But for various reasons, and despite some measure of success, participation in both these contests, among others, left an assortment of bad tastes in my mouth. Without airing too much dirty laundry in public, I will say that I trace many of the problems to the nature of design competitions themselves. Competitions create a culture that devalues our labor. Competitions often cultivate animosity among colleagues, and competitions often permeate spectacle over substantive architectural achievement. Of course, I expect that many of you practicing outside the US may have different opinions, since I have heard, correctly or not, that European contests are more regulated by laws and professional organizations. Your contest is an interesting case, however, since it involves an American institution staging a competition for a private building on public land in a European country. After examining the competition conditions, not to be confused with the competition briefs, I found it evident, though not clear, that the competition is not for an architectural commission. The only prizes explicitly guaranteed to the winners are monetary and the associated bragging rights. I look forward to being corrected if necessary, but the following passage from page 8 in the conditions seems to disclaim any obligation or commitment of the organizers to build the winning proposal. Quote, a decision on whether to proceed with the construction and development of the museum is expected to be brought to the city of Helsinki and the state of Finland for consideration following the conclusion of the competition and the public announcement of the winning design, end quote. As a matter of fact, a search of the same document reveals that the words commission, contract, or negotiation are not to be found. So it appears that yours is actually an ideas competition and marketing campaign that might inspire a building project by someone, somewhere, sometime in the future. Okay, fine. The winners will receive enough money to recoup some portion of their actual costs. The rest will console themselves with whatever prestige falls from the brief afterglow of the whole spectacle. And as I wrote last year, many, if not most, architects don't care that competitions are bad business. That discussion has been well covered by others with deeper knowledge of professional practice and is not the point of this letter. I'm only trying to ask, where does it all end? How much of our careers and lives are we willing to give? How far will we bend for the ever more limited promise of increasingly uncertain rewards? Earlier in this letter, I mentioned that despite my early retirement, I had a recent re-engagement with the competition industry. Against better judgment, I attended the final presentations for a major design competition in Chicago just a few weeks ago. It was a closed session for the organizers and a few members of the political and design communities. And as usual, each team presented their requisite manifestos, slides, video animations, etc. I found the entire show to be excruciating. Not because of the design proposals, but because of the architects' performances. Their faces were a mixture of desperation and barely masked contempt for their self-imposed captivity. At one point, I found myself head down, ears covered, and overwhelmed by the pathos of the whole scene. One contestant from a well-established Chicago firm actually stripped to reveal a t-shirt with their project logo. Free t-shirts were provided for all in attendance. I left the building that night feeling personal shame, not disappointment in those other architects, after realizing that I had subjected myself to the same indignities on a similar stage just 2 years ago. At the time, I had felt privileged and honored to sit alongside so many accomplished and notable professionals like Bjarke Ingels, Martha Schwartz, and James Corner. But only after witnessing a similar scene from the outside do I now realize that I was just another sad prisoner in the lineup. So what is the end game? You will all submit your projects, and after the submissions, you will likely be asked to give public presentations. These performances could be broadcast to the entire world. The jury will meet and hand down their decision. Prizes will be awarded. Critics will pass judgment. Some of you will receive more prestigious academic appointments. A museum may be built. Another blockbuster competition will probably be announced later this year, and we will all move on. Yet while writing this letter, I've begun to imagine other endings to the story. For example, Jerold, I may need some legal help after this is all over. So, for example, what if you decided not to complete your projects? Or what if you complete the projects but stage a group exhibition instead of handing them over? What if you insisted on renegotiating the terms of the competition before submitting? What if you all just walked away? Some will accuse me of being cynical, sanctimonious, overly judgmental, or naive, and they may be right on all counts. But in my own defense, these words come from a colleague who has been where you are at this moment and wishes that he could have sooner had the resolution and foresight to turn from this path we architects are expected to follow. As I wrote 1 year ago, quote, "The old argument that competitions drive architectural innovation is no longer credible. Developers, cultural institutions, and government agencies have mastered the use of design competitions as publicity campaigns. Their claim of searching for the best ideas is just an alibi that unfortunately continues to seduce too many of our best talents. The real justifications are simple. Developers and institutions gain fantastic and relatively affordable publicity from the mad traveling circus of design competitions. By helping them attract financing and donors, we encourage the proliferation of these sham exercises where enormous projects are fully rendered without contracts, necessary approvals, or even clear programs in some cases, etc." End quote. So, from what I've been able to surmise from a brief examination, the GHDC submits fairly well to this assessment. But most of you probably knew this from the beginning and soldiered forth regardless of the real odds or evident risks. Therefore, I conclude this letter with thanks for your time, an open invitation to respond, and 2 simple words: good luck. With sincere fellowship and appreciation, Marshall Brown, architect.
What a way to start. Why is it that I always get these panels? Can't I just have the happy little old architect who won a competition and never asked a question about it again? Marshall, thank you for that provocative beginning. We're going to spend, just so everybody's familiar with the format, and then we won't repeat this because it'll go on for the rest of the day. Now, there'll be 10 minutes of Q&A with the group here. Then we'll follow up the next 2 speakers. And then there'll be 10 minutes of Q&A with them, the Q&A between the moderator and the 2 speakers, and that'll be the same in the afternoon. Then there will be 15 minutes of Q&A between you and the speakers and the moderator if you feel like you need to engage the moderator for some reason. Let's begin. Let's start just in the order that we went. And the first question that I would have for you, Kara, is why, don't worry, it's not going to be quite a full Marshall on you yet. We'll go there in a minute. That'll be your takeaway for today. From now on, it's a full Marshall. I should also back up and say Marshall worked at Cranbrook in my second to last year there and was a fantastic and provocative instructor there too, and really tried to engage his students in similarly strong kind of dialogue. It was great. Everybody loved it. Why did the Guggenheim decide to do a competition? You'd already launched one fantastically famous building, then you had another big one in the Middle East. Why this method of selection?
I mean, I think it was a genuinely authentic marriage between Finnish culture and the Guggenheim. Public buildings need to go through a competition process in Finland. So
all public buildings?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
So for us, it was an interesting opportunity to, since architecture is part of the programming, to use it as a way to explore what ideas are out there architecturally. And like I said, that's one of the reasons I felt strongly that students or people with a graduate degree, not just registered architects, should be encouraged to participate. And I saw it as something that my generation, that's kind of emerging talents, would embrace and be excited about, and for a lot of the same reasons David talked about in terms of a certain amount of prestige associated with being a finalist, but also with, I don't know, even just being able to show in your portfolio of work that type of project.
Let's say this had been the Guggenheim Del Rio, Texas. Would you think hey, Del Rio is great. You haven't been there. Do you think you would have still done a competition?
That's a really good question. I mean, one thing that was noticeably absent, I mentioned Tom Krenz, I mentioned Richard, David. The old Tom Krenz model had the big boys always, or Zaha, featured as part of the vision. And I think part of the feasibility studies for Helsinki lacked a vision because there was no building. So I think to some extent there was it's not as warm of a reception because there wasn't a vision associated with it. With Texas, I doubt we would have. I think part of us doing it was the marriage with Finland and seeing an opportunity, but we weren't the ones that originally, we were following the kind of protocol in Finland, working with SAFA, which is the equivalent of the AIA. But I do think the thinking that was going on about architecture in Texas, I don't think we would have taken a traditional route in terms of commissioning a building there.
Okay, so that's a sort of nuanced answer. Let me bore down on that again, which is, you can forget Del Rio, Texas. Having been through the experience, would you, if you were doing the next Guggenheim, in a place that didn't require competitions?
Total pros and cons. I mean, I totally relate to what Marshall says. I mean, I've worked on all sides of this, right? That's why I was trying to point out, I worked for Frank, I worked, for a nonprofit, for the Guggenheim, directing architectural projects, and now I run a design studio. So I really see it in shades of gray. I think that there really are some amazing things about competitions, but I think it's sort of, at a certain point in your career, it's a right time to engage in it, and at a certain point in your career, I agree, step back, it's not for you. It does cost money. It does, it's time away from other projects that you're paying for. On the other hand, I feel like when I've worked, on competitions, it's a different buzz than you do when you're working with a client. And I think there's an energy in an office when there's a competition. There's a freedom because you're not answering to a client regularly. And it's almost like school, the way you have this kind of freedom to think about a lot of different things. It's, and I'm lucky to have had some really amazing clients with the places that I work and what I do. But I think that there's that spark is something that some architects forget, some firms forget. And I think that's a good reason to take on those challenges.
Okay.
Of a competition.
One more question for you, and then we're going to jump over to Marshall for just a second. You're a studio leader at Rockwell Group now.
Yes.
Would you, as a studio leader at Rockwell Group, take your studio into the Guggenheim competition?
Yeah, maybe. I think that like a very particular competition that I would consider. I'm not sure David would agree with me, but I'd say right now, on the other hand, the types of projects I have there are so creative and so interesting that I wouldn't need that spark. But if I felt that I was doing a lot of similar kind of work and I wanted to do something creative, and there was for me, the Guggenheim competition really distinguishes itself from a lot of other competitions because of the legacy of the Guggenheim versus just any old competition.
Okay. Marshall.
Yes, sir.
So, more gray hair. Do you think the Guggenheim competition was qualitatively any different than some of the others you've seen that led to your objection? In composing your letter, did you analyze the competition in a way that revealed anything about it to you that might have distinguished it from other competitions?
I read the competition conditions and both of the briefs fairly carefully, and it seemed there were a lot of elements that I recognized. It seemed like kind of a hybrid, and it also, and this is something I mentioned in the letter, it seemed like it was positioning itself as a competition for a commission, but it was actually, when you read the fine print, seems to me something more like an ideas competition. Only time will tell, right? It will depend on whether or not one of these proposals gets built. But yeah, I mean, most of the aspects, yes, were elements that I recognized with a few new twists. Like, for example, I noticed that they're asking for a 3D printing file, right, for all of the proposals, which I thought, well, that's a new and very time-consuming and expensive twist on the submission requirements. But you know, these things happen over time. But actually, yeah, I mean, most of the things I found in the brief were pretty familiar. I did find that the well, no, I mean, they're all different. So, for example, the Navy Pier project I participated in, the program and the competition brief were really too vague, right? I mean, we didn't even get the final submission requirements till a couple of weeks before it was due. You know, how many panels and, you know, the documentation, everything like that. And but, you know, for example, for the National Museum of African American History, there had been a whole kind of programming exercise that had preceded it, and so it was very detailed. So they're all different. But the Guggenheim, see, I broke a rule. I wasn't going to say the G word all day. See, you guys put me in this corner. And but in this competition, I found it to be kind of a mix of a lot of things that I had seen.
All right, so let me ask you to step back from the G word, the G spot, and ask you to think about it more generally. Do you object to all professional architectural competitions then? Professional meaning architectural competitions that are targeted toward professional practicing architects as opposed to something you might get in school?
I think for me, the issue is not being against competitions. For me, the issue is being for architects.
Clever sophistry.
But that's really true. It's really true. It's really true.
Push that button one more time.
Look, I was like several people in this room. I was educated in the _90s, and you know, under the immediately following the kind of twin victories of Schumi and La Valette and Libeskind in Berlin, and so. I've done plenty of competitions. You know, I did them after school, ideas competitions, and the article I wrote last year says very clearly, like, I'm not necessarily against the ideas competitions like the ones that Van Alen runs, especially for more junior architects, et cetera, et cetera. I think those can be very useful. So it's not about being against all competitions, and I think clearly some design competitions have brought, you know, incredible projects, built or unbuilt, into our world, like the High Line, for example. So I don't want to be so dogmatic as that. But based on my personal and yet anecdotal experiences, the kind of ultimate cost-benefit analysis put me in the kind of side that I'm on.
Okay, I'm going to reserve a question for you in our next panel when we get everybody together, which may kick off the whole thing for everybody else's discussion. But for now, please help me thank both of our first presenters. I don't know that I have to return to the mic. So yes, return to the mic, young man. Okay, so our next speaker, can we have? Do I flip this, or does somebody else turn the page, or does it matter? Okay, so our next two speakers will be Scott Davis. I'm going to do this in order of what's in your program this time to get it right, who's a senior advisor at HUD and was very much involved with the Rebuild by Design competition, and also had previous experience, I think, that I hope was useful in that he was engaged in New Orleans after Katrina, the other big water-based crisis that has happened over the last 10 years. And then he'll be joined, or followed by Gina Worth, and then joined on stage one of an associate at SCAPE, the landscape architectural practice, that was engaged in that process so provocatively and interestingly, and I think we'll have a great and different kind of conversation. So please help me welcome both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. Being that it's a relatively recent competition, and assuming that you're all fairly familiar with it, I'm gonna, and at the advice of Jerold, I'm just gonna jump right into the questions that have been kind of trying to answer some of the questions that have been posed this morning and last night about Rebuild by Design. I'm going to go over kind of a few elements of what made it innovative, we think, a few of the lessons learned, and some general observations. So in terms of elements of innovation, the first was a big carrot. That's not innovative. I guess what's innovative is the really, really, really big size of this carrot. It's not often that kind of a presidential cabinet member has $1 billion to spend at his or her discretion, but that's a big carrot that'll bring a lot of people to the table. And so when Sean Donovan calls up a Judy Roden at the Rockefeller and says, you know, I've got this idea, it really enables partnerships to come together. To do things like that, and because the best story that the president of a foundation wants to be able to do is go back to their board and say, we just spent $5 million to influence $1 billion. That's a success story. So we were able to establish some really great innovative partnerships with government, nonprofits, philanthropy, and academia. To rally around this. The second innovative element is that it's we always viewed it as fundamentally collaborative, not competitive. We in the very beginning in the design brief, the call mandated interdisciplinary design teams, and we kind of only half jokingly at the kickoff for the competition kind of said, to all the design teams, welcome to the competition. The competition's now over. You all have won. Let's get started with coming up with some innovative ideas. And that was possible because more than one winner was possible, and they all weren't working on the same site necessarily. So, it's not 5 different variations on a library or a museum. It's a problem that we're looking to solve in different places and regional at scale. So that was one thing that truly, I think, enabled a more collaborative atmosphere and working condition. The third is that it started with stepping back and recognizing, the first half of the competition was just dedicated to defining the problem. And then, the second half was, okay, now let's focus on solving it. But until we really understood the nature of the problem, or better understood the nature of the problem at a regional scale, we felt that kind of framing design problems at a more localized and prescripted level would be missing a huge opportunity for understanding and learning. So that was, that's the other thing, that how it differs from normal competitions. Well, that kind of solicit, we want X thing at X site for X amount of dollars, and then you guys get to play within that box. But our box is much larger. The fourth is the focus on implementability. There's always this tension between constraints and freedom in generating ideas. We tried to provide a lot of freedom in kind of being able to vision and envision new processes and new solutions, but at the same time kind of saying that this isn't just an exercise and it's not just an ideas competition. We're looking to affect real world change in the built environment, tomorrow. And so with that came a focus on implementability. And so in terms of what does that mean, it means that your proposal doesn't just need to be kind of technologically competent in terms of engineering principles. It needs to be financially feasible. It needs to be politically feasible and have the support of local stakeholders, local elected officials, and deal with the real politics of the area. And it has to be legally feasible. It has to, if you can't get this thing permitted without an act of Congress, that's a problem. And then it just becomes an ideas competition. And we're looking for something more than that. So to the focus on implementability, it really involved a lot of deep stakeholder outreach and public engagement to really kind of all the teams connecting with everyone from, a small neighborhood group all the way up to a United States senator to really make sure that priorities were aligned across the spectrum. This is just an example of just what kind of the OMA teams process looked like. And at the end, each of our projects had dozens of letters of support, again, from local community groups all the way up to United States senators. And this is what really lays the ground for us and for the public sector to feel confident making an investment in a place is laying the groundwork for this investment to succeed. It really takes a lot of the risk out of public investment. So in terms of lessons learned, if we could do it all again, I moderated a panel with my good friend and colleague Hank Govink on it a while back, and I asked him, so Hank, if we could do it all over again, what would you do differently? And he said nothing, of course. But I think there are some things that we could do differently again if we had the opportunity. A lot of these things we just weren't possible because of the environment that we're operating in a post-disaster environment. One is to be able to kind of fully develop an administrative and management plan prior to launching the competition. This was kind of just a challenge of, again, the timing of a post-disaster environment and congressional appropriations, but kind of we had to launch a flight. We took off in a plane without having without being able to have the ailerons fully designed, let alone the landing gear. And so in an ideal scenario, you definitely want to do that. The other is to be able to clearly communicate the demand expectations up front to the participants, the design teams. We did communicate was that everyone was taking a huge leap of faith at the outset. We tried to back that up with at least saying, there's at least $200,000 worth of faith for each of you in this, but there's a good deal that everyone's going to have to take on, and but to the degree that you can very clearly kind of articulate what the research demands will be, what the public engagement demands will be, what to Marshall's point about the deliverables. Do you need 3D, printing schematics or programs? And so being able to communicate all that up front lets them make that decision better about, is it worthy of their time, and do they have the capacity to participate in a meaningful way? The third would be for larger prize awards, recognizing now at the back end how participatory and involved this was. That scaling the size of the prize awards closer to the degree of participation and commitment. If you can get that a little more closely matched up, then it eliminates a lot of the risk for the participants. And I think that's key. The fourth lesson learned, also identifying upfront a range of funding available for possible implementation. That was one of the, I think there's two ends of the spectrum. There's one, I think, Craig last night mentioned, you could say, here's your budget, plus or minus 10% is what we're looking for. And for us, we said, think big and don't financially scale your ideas. Just give us ideas, and then we'll address them. But I think landing somewhere in the middle with kind of a range is helpful and would be helpful to guide teams into scaling their solutions. The fifth is to finally establish a clear pathway to procurement for winning design teams. And that also helps lower or eliminate the risk for participating teams. We're unable to do that for a number of reasons that we can get into later, just due to our federal authority and our use of funds. For this competition and how we had to allocate the funds. We aren't giving design teams the money to build the projects because teams don't build these things. Local governments do, and so that's who has the money. And then ultimately, and I'm just going to go through this quickly, kind of barriers to replicating this model elsewhere. So one is large amounts of discretionary funding are very rare. You just don't find this. Also, commitment from the federal government at the highest level. We had a presidential task force kind of leading this, and because of that, we're able to get a high degree of responsiveness from state, local, and other federal government agencies to bring them to the table, to force them to the table to inform the competition process. The third is, connections between kind of producing ideas for state and local government and actually requiring those local governments to implement them are two different things, and it's a very delicate balance. One is, as mentioned, you could give an idea to them and they'll say, thank you, we'll consider this. Or we're trying to say, you're going to build this, and that's a very different role for federal government, and so it's a different kind of political relationship that has to develop over the course of a competition, so that the grantees are bought into it. The fourth is that time and place are huge factors. It's let's call it the Del Rio factor. If this was rebuilt by design Del Rio or Brownsville, it would be different. There's a lack of sexiness between Del Rio and Manhattan, and not the presence of top-tier design talent in that part of the world. So, and general observations, though, I think overall there are a lot of things that we could do differently and better. I think there's a lot of value in the model. I think the win-win-win is that everyone came out smarter and more capable. Government did, philanthropy did, all the partners and nonprofits, the design teams, and the public that participated in the conversation. And the other thing is that while I remember in reviewing the initial solicitations and applications amongst the 148 design teams, we are anticipating that with all these world-class designers that we would find a few egos in the process. And surprisingly, none were found. It was just really an extraordinary group. And maybe it's because of the collaborative nature, but because, and that handsome lad in the back there on the left is Mr. Leer. It was just, an incredible experience, and I think that's one of the things that also enabled some of these great solutions to come about. And that's it. I'm a few minutes over, but Gina's going to compliment. So, thanks.
Hello, so I am Gina Worth, a design principal at Scape Landscape Architecture, and our office was lucky enough to participate in the HUD Rebuild by Design competition under the stewardship of many talented professionals, including Scott. And I thought I would start today by very briefly introducing the project and the work, because it's difficult for me to talk about the process without talking about the project, but then try to take a step back and kind of discuss why we chose to engage in this, what it's meant for the office, and how we see it kind of shaping the world in the future, because that is the goal. So Living Breakwaters was our proposal for this competition that was ultimately selected for $60 million of federal implementation funding. It's a proposal for the South Shore of Staten Island, and the grantee was New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, who is currently in the process of executing and implementing the processes that will lead to this work, including an environmental impact statement. The project was very much developed by a team. At Scape, we always begin with a team, and the competition brief asked us to begin with a team. There are no lonely nights at Scape. We have lots of partners, lots of friends. It also makes things much more expensive and much more complicated to collaborate. But we see that as a real benefit of this project and as of our work in general. So the Scape team was led by landscape architects, by ourselves, Scape Landscape Architecture, based in New York City. We had 3 major engineering partners on the project, Stevens Institute of Technology, Parsons Brinkerhoff, Ocean and Coastal Consultants. We had a marine biologist on the project. We had a school on the project. We had an architect, a graphic designer, and a writer on the project. And really, there was a big idea behind this proposal and this work, and it was really that resiliency does not need to be refined as a kind of singular engineering-driven solution, but resiliency in response to climate change pressures and storm surge and wave action within this area that was so visible and so painful during Hurricane Sandy really needs to embody kind of cultural resilience, ecological resilience, and risk reduction, to really think about these 3 kind of points simultaneously and design for them simultaneously. Our site was the South Shore of Staten Island, and the site was developed through a kind of long research process. But Staten Island, South Shore, receives a huge amount of wave action during these types of storms. During Sandy, it lost acres and acres of land. It's lost acres of land in the past hundreds of years and will continue to lose acres of land from erosion. And so our proposal really began to think about how to mitigate that land loss, how to reduce risk, how to reduce the most life-threatening elements of coastal climate change, but also how to do that in a way that does not sever the relationship with the shoreline. So this is truly the big idea behind this project and proposal. This is not a competition that landed in a kind of formal physical product. This is a competition proposal based upon the idea of how do we consider a new shoreline condition that is safer, that is more resilient, that is ecologically robust, and that sets up a new relationship with the shoreline within New York. The competition also offered a lot of opportunities to test, to be technically rigorous, and begin to test and experiment with the proposal. This is ultimately a kind of larger scale proposal that was presented, 3 reaches of breakwaters that would reduce wave action along the shoreline, create a shallow water environment, and protect communities from wave action. It would not stop water. It would allow water to still continue to permeate these neighborhood edges. There would still be some risks and burdens of climate change events left on the table, but it would be a kind of safer relationship with water in the future. And we also began to really look at how this infrastructural system could be designed in relationship to habitat and to ecology. And that's not really the point of what we're talking about today, but the point is that these infrastructures and the way they've been applied to so many of our shorelines, whether they are in New York City, whether they're in Louisiana, often don't take the other systems into account or into play. So this system really responds to the creation of intertidal and subtidal habitat, exposed island habitat for harbor seals and nesting birds, and then a kind of sediment-rich habitat behind in the shallow, calmer, protected water. It also really builds upon the kind of elements of place. This is a kind of historic image of oyster farming and oyster culture in the South Shore of Staten Island. And this is really what I think designers bring to these conversations about big infrastructure, is what does climate change protection have to do with oyster restoration? A politician maybe wouldn't think about that as a kind of initial approach to a site, nor would an engineer. And that's why it's so important to think about designers leading many of these types of efforts. The project also tried to look inland and consider the wider community that was impacted by these climate change pressures and try to involve them, even if they do not live exactly along the shoreline. So our whole project was also about reaching in and kind of engaging schools and the youth along the waterfront and trying to build capacity and stewardship along the waterfront itself. This took the form of educational programming. It also took the form of kind of architecture here in the form of water hubs, kind of that would be shoreline access points and community nodes along the edge. And this is the kind of one of the final images we presented for the competition that really shows the larger scale protective breakwater infrastructure in the background, some of the social resiliency components in the foreground, and some of the kind of ecological stewardship activities around. But this is where I talk a little bit about why this is so important to us, why this project is so important to us, and what this competition enabled us as designers to do. So Motion last night said that competitions are, kind of question the idea, are competitions a gift to architects? In this case, this competition was absolutely a gift to our office in that it allowed us to be a leader in the conversations around infrastructure, which so rarely happens. Infrastructure conversations are almost exclusively led by engineers and shaped by politicians, and this allowed us to present a new format for rethinking what our shorelines should be and how they should respond. And so we posed this question. It allowed us to ask this question of what does it mean to design a system that has some elements of risk reduction, cultural resilience, and ecological resilience. And really, truly, that system has been untested, and it offers an opportunity within the competition to test. Designers also offer the opportunity to think about the everyday. David mentioned this, and it was also mentioned earlier in the conference proceedings about the popular vote, right? Ultimately, the people are the ones who will experience these places, and we are translators and have to make place that people actually enjoy. That is incredibly true when you think about the kind of conditions of New Orleans and how shoreline infrastructure and waterway infrastructure has truly changed that city's relationship with the city, with the water. Secondly, this competition allowed us to kind of revel in research, which is very difficult and time-consuming to do, and we appreciated the focus on that. We were able to kind of step out of our box, look outside the bounds of New York City, and begin to consider how this approach and strategy could be developed and formed in many other conditions and places. Ultimately, the work was really shaped around this idea of shallow water and shallow water ecological infrastructure, and how this does not look like a very dramatic design proposal or a sexy rendering, but this is at the kind of core component of our project, and it's one of our major design deliverables in this conversation, in that this is a proposal for shoreline change which does not rely upon a singular piece of protective infrastructure. It relies upon a layered approach that invites communities in to the water, sets up new relationships with the water in New York, and advocates for kind of long-term ecological stewardship of the shoreline being as primary of a goal as flood reduction. So that is an idea. Design exchange was a really critical piece of this competition, both within our team, within our process, and within the kind of communities we were trying to foster this project and approach within. You can imagine it's quite difficult to say to a community that you are not trying to keep all of the water out of their home. You are trying to consider oysters, you're trying to consider shellfish or harbor seals in addition to the kind of flooding conditions of their house. But this was really enabled by this huge amount of outreach and conversations that were had with this work. This is just a list. Craig had mentioned the competition that was created in a locked room in the basement, and this is the opposite of that competition. There were no locked rooms. I would have loved to live in a little locked room for 2 days during this competition and have some time to work, but most of it was actually spent in a zip car traveling around Staten Island, traveling around New York, and meeting with different agency partners, meeting with different members of the Rebuild by Design team, and meeting with different members of the community. And that really builds into one of my final points, which is really in these projects and these processes, we are not only building a rendering, we're not only building a building, we're not only building a process. And much of the work and any idea that is truly transformative or changes a kind of current regime, you have to think about building a coalition of support that will extend and advance your ideas for the longer term. We're talking about infrastructure, if it is actually built, will exist for 50, 100, 150 years. It's very critical that we begin to engage those partners today. So we built a political coalition, very importantly, a scientific coalition around the work, as the project is a large-scale pilot project, an experiment, a community coalition, and a regulatory coalition. And I know I'm out of time, but I'm going to end on this one final point, which is really about, and I think it's also a challenge to kind of students in the audience today. When you work on competitions, there is a huge intellectual drain. And often, if there's no clear product from that work, you're not the winner, it's sometimes very disheartening. At SCAPE, we advocate and we have ideas about big infrastructure, but we also really try to execute small infrastructure within our projects and our processes. So much of our competition product was actually very small-scale events and products that could be created during the competition, shared, and have their own kind of catalytic effects. So I would challenge you and ask you, what can you produce during a competition that someone else can actually use and is beneficial? We do these projects because ultimately we want to change the world. Can we use these competitions as a way of creating tools to help others change the world? So this is a teacher training session that the Harbor School, one of our partners, led. It's a number of teachers teaching Staten Island, a number of Harbor School students teaching Staten Island teachers how to garden with oysters. We made a manual as one of the competition products for oyster gardening, and there's a number of schools doing oyster gardening along the shoreline today as a direct result of that competition. So we tried very hard to think about, if we did not win, or our project did not win funding for federal implementation, how could we also continue to think about how could the results of the competition actually change the future of Staten Island Shore? So I will end there. Thank you.
No, not that far away. Come on down here. What do I look like? That's scary. I showered. All right, Scott and Gina. Now, we are a little over time, so I'm going to, may I use the full time? Oh, great. All right, so we've got an hour and a half now. I'm at everybody's time for the rest of the day. Yeah? Okay, good. Let's concentrate on a few different kinds of issues here. This is a big and very different kind of competition than some of the ones I think people are thinking about today. Let me ask a really general question, starting with you, Scott. Why did you guys decide to do this using a competition process versus just selecting half a dozen different teams and bringing them in?
Right. I think that's a great question. It's been the one that's been asked a number of times, is how can competitions differ from a procurement process, right?
Especially with federal.
Yes, and it's that you couldn't procure these products. There's no way that you could procure an outcome like this and have it be so informed in the way that it was by all of this scientific community, the research community, the public. You can procure a public engagement process like that, but to bring all of the state and federal government agencies to the table to inform the design process was something that where the federal government played a unique role, that we could bring, the permitting. If SCAPE is looking to do something in the water, we could bring the permitting agencies that are involved in permitting that project to them during the process, so that can inform their outcome.
No, that's great. That I understand, and it's laudable. But I mean, you still, as the federal government, might have still performed that role simply by identifying 6 clustered teams and brought them to bear. Was there something about competition in selecting the final projects that was different for you, that you thought would make the process different for your end users or whomever you were trying to reach?
Oh, yeah, I guess it's a
tricky
challenge.
question.
It's a
It's
tricky question
complicated.
because
Yeah.
we didn't have when we started the competition, we didn't even know the 10 places where they would be engaged.
working, okay.
So we didn't know who the actual clients would be, whether it would be Staten Island or whomever. It started with, look at this region, and then kind of the teams were tasked with finding their client, if you will, in terms of state or local government that would, steward this project through to completion. But so it was a difficult thing. We didn't know, and we didn't know the solution to procure. We couldn't have written a statement of work that said, this is what we want.
And a competition enabled you to do that.
Right.
Because it enabled you to structure a framework around it.
This one enabled us to define the problem for which we would ultimately procure, I guess. So
right.
Perhaps after the first stage, we could have procured, you can procure that, but that's the nature of that two-stage process.
Okay, technical question, and I'm going to go to you for the next part and invert this. So I heard you mention $200,000. Let me ask you, what did you pay each of the competing teams to do their work?
So overall, there was $2 million available for cash prize awards, and that was split equally amongst the 10 finalist teams selected to participate in the competition. So each team...
Were they selected by RFQ?
They were selected by the Sandy Rebuilding Task Force.
Based on an RFQ or based on...
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Essentially. RFQ plus proposal of concepts as well.
So concepts came in.
Yes, not just qualifications, but qualifications and conceptual approach.
I would say approach, not a...
Not a solution, just how you were going to go after the project.
Correct.
Okay. And each team then ended up with $200,000.
Correct.
Okay, so now let me turn to you and say, how much did you spend in your office? Did you, go to what we were suggested someone, that people follow this, do you have any idea what you really spent in your office, all of your offices, the whole team?
Yeah, so we have done some kind of internal calculations, and I'm not going to reveal the fragility of Scape's finances within this public context, but I think one of the points I made about having a large interdisciplinary team is that is the richness of the proposal and the project and the work. $200,000 would be a lot of money for a competition, for a typical competition that Scape would participate in. With 8 partners, it doesn't go very far.
That's 20. If you divided it equally, it's $25,000.
And it's not to suggest that we divided it equally. There were a lot of different factors and levels of participation within the team.
So after you took your 150, then
Right.
That we are
exactly.
more generous and more collaborative than that for sure. Yeah. So, but the point is, if you considered Escape getting $200,000, we spent probably 3 or 4 or 5 times that on this work, not considering the work of the other teams.
And that was the average throughout all of the teams. Rockefeller commissioned an evaluation of the process, and the teams reported back that they all spent between 3 and 5 times their award amount.
So you did check that. Okay, that's
Yes.
great. Between 3 and 5. So that puts an actual number on some of what we saw in the data from Architectural Record. Given that, was it a project? This is a 2-part question. Was it a project that was worth the investment of the firm? And you can measure worth any way you'd like. And just skip your partners for a second and treat yourself as a summary judge, okay, for that. And then second, would you do it again?
Well, so I do not have ownership share in the office, so I feel very free to answer this question. I say absolutely, it was worth it for us. I think Scape is also a very kind of unique case. We would be heartbroken if we did not win this competition and that we did not see the ideas advance, because we did this proposal in this competition to see an idea executed. The genesis of the work that you saw here was another kind of design competition or collaboration or whatever you want to call it, produced for the Museum of Modern Art for the Rising Currents exhibition. Stephen's very familiar with that project, and that was the kind of genesis of the ideas of thinking about linking ecological infrastructure and coastal protection infrastructure within New York. That was an ideas competition, essentially, in that it lived in the museum. It had a huge amount of publicity and kind of general support, but it never was adopted by policymakers or regulators or anyone to actually implement. So this, for us, was an opportunity to implement, to see our ideas implemented. Hopefully that will pay out. We have great faith that will pay out in the future. There's a lot of uncertainty about what our role will be in it playing out in the future. I think we're confident that we will participate in that. But this is a kind of yes. The answer, I think, is yes. The answer is yes. Okay. There's not many formats and opportunities for landscape architects to get involved and lead engineering projects. There's an entire school and department here devoted to landscape architecture firms leading engineering practices. We need more opportunities like this to be able to show what we offer in those conversations. And we greatly appreciate that there was some stipend because it did allow some, actual effort to be put from the office. It was not a project purely run and staffed by interns, as unfortunately so many competitions are.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and I want you to keep your answers relatively brief on this one, only because we're just about out of time on this section. You referred to in your opening statement, and you also referred to in yours, the open-endedness of the challenge, of the competition brief. Addressing it from the different perspectives, did you find that open-endedness intimidating prior to starting the competition? When you were reading the brief, the invitation for the first time, did you find it intimidating? Obviously you did it, but did you find it intimidating? Secondly, would you do it again with something quite that open-ended, or would you try and focus something down? So let's start with the intimidation factor.
I do not think we were intimidated at all by the open-endedness because we are a research-based practice, and that is how we try to start many of our projects, and to actually have that process formalized, compensated by some means is actually quite useful. But I would also say, and maybe to Scott's chagrin, we came into this competition with an agenda. We had a set of ideas we wanted to explore. Having an open-ended site was enormously useful for us, in that we were able to use the research process to help define a site that was most suitable for the application of those ideas. No, it's not intimidating. It was wonderful. It's what good designers do. It's what this school teaches. It's what many school teaches. Having the opportunity to research, have it formally reviewed, have a conversation about it, be in a collaborative community of designers executing design research is hugely important. And I think that's one thing competitions offer.
Okay, Scott, real quickly, would you do it again with something quite that open-ended?
At the outset, yes. I think maybe at the end of the first stage, once folks kind of settle down on where they're engaging, then I think it is helpful to provide some kind of bounds so that they know are they designing for a $2 billion strategy or a $75 million project. Those are two different scales of engagement that we can at least help bound. But I think leaving it open, left it open for all of the teams came up with comprehensive strategies, and which I think are hugely valuable. We're just funding the implementation of the first phase of these larger strategies. So, the replication of these strategies across Staten Island or around Lower Manhattan or throughout the Meadowlands can hopefully continue on.
Great, thank you. I want to recommend that everybody here visit the website and the website for this conference, and also for this competition. It was a very different kind of competition because of its scale, intentionally. There's also a lot of information about what happened in New Orleans on a whole variety of sites. And this competition and that one that are disaster-based raise a lot of questions that are really unanswered in any kind of systematic way about how you do these sorts of things and end up with meaningful results because of the shifting, and this is a terrible metaphor, but because of the shifting sands of the communities for which they're made, because the political side that you referred to is so difficult to wrap your hands around. So please help me thank these two panelists. Don't go anywhere. Stay here. Stay here. And now we're going to be joined by our first two panelists, right? And we're going to have about 15 minutes of an opportunity for you all to ask them questions about anything you'd like. So my job is to point at you. And if you don't ask, I will. See, it always the threat ends up. I see two hands up. I'm going to start with the gentleman with the beard because he actually beat you to the punch, gentleman with the unintentional beard. So first we'll go with that one.
Oh, thanks. Gina, you talked about how rising currents provided the basis for your proposal for rebuild by design. Do you think that your entry would have been as successful had you not been incubating it for those years? And also, a lot of the coalitions you talked about, were they formed during and after rising currents and then paid off and rebuild?
A lot of the coalitions that we formed, so a couple of them, like the relationship with the Harbor School, was sparked with the oyster texture proposal for the Museum of Modern Art. A couple of them, like the relationship with Phil Orton at Stevens Institute and Sea Art Consulting, the marine biologist we work with, who's developing these new materials for ecological concrete. Those were formed after we had the exhibition, and the exhibition had a lot of publicity associated with it. Those people reached out to us and we began these conversations. And then Rebuild by Design offered the opportunity to actually formalize a working relationship and test a potential collaboration in the form of a project. So in that way, Rising Currents was highly successful as a collaboration or a competition in that it actually brought together a new coalition here. I think your first question was, would Rebuild by Design been as successful had we not had those ideas cultivated? I think so. I think it would have been successful due to the research process. That's something we're very familiar with. I think more and more landscape architectural education is starting with research as a kind of beginning of a design process, and it would have not led to the same result or same product that you saw today, but it would have led, I think, to an equally interesting result or product. All of us as designers have a lot of ideas brewing in our head, and we explore them in many different ways, and competitions can be a very useful way of crystallizing them. And so I can think of 4 other projects we would have advanced if we did not do oyster texture at the Museum of Modern Art that we could have advanced with this competition, this framework. Yeah.
Just a second thought on that, though. Infrastructure projects take a really long time, right? So to the other projects, the 2 other projects in New York City, for instance, they don't seem quite as implementable right off the, from starting from now as the Escape project does, and I think it might have something to do with the fact that this was actually being designed for about 8 years rather than 1 year.
Well, the Escape project has serious implementation hurdles as well in the form of the regulatory context. I showed a lot of, kind of like community-driven images and kind of like poppy colors and hot pink and bright green, but some of the real conversations that were enabled by Rebuild by Design were the very serious regulatory conversations. So I would say that was one of the things that was also most useful about the competition, was that Rebuild by Design and the level and the largesse of the carrot, right, that Scott mentioned, that there was federal funding backing it, actually enabled serious regulatory conversations and serious agency conversations, whereas all of our work that was around oyster texture and around the earlier ideas never got to that level of depth or appreciation or seriousness. It was never received as seriously. So it was able to advance in that way, I think, quite well. I don't think I'm totally answering your question. But.
Okay, I'm going to go back and try again. The handsome gentleman who looks like a French singer. How's that? Is that better than unintentional beard?
Yeah, the unintentional beard is because I have a 2-month-old baby at home, so shaving is really I had to negotiate a lot to be here this morning.
And listening to you talk, I actually expect you to start singing at any minute.
Oh, well, thank you, by the way. Anyway, my name is Gabriel Duarte. I'm a visiting scholar from Brazil, and also a practicing architect.
Brazil, France.
Yeah, they're all kind of the
They're
same.
all the
I know.
same,
My wife
yeah.
is French. Yeah, I guess it was like you get.
You're just reifying everything I've said.
Actually, I have a question to all of them. I've been in the same position as many of you, like running an office and taking part in competitions and being most of the times frustrated and very few times successful. I imagine what would be a suggestion of a different model of competition that could, in a way, buffer the negative, results of that. So us losing money, us competing against other offices who have way more resources than I do. For example, I have a small to medium-sized office in Rio, and I know how much it costs to actually take part in a competition, whereas proportionally this cost is too high for me. But for an office, let's say like Gary, it's like a small fraction of, let's say, a monthly or yearly budget. So is there a way that we can find a way? I mean, competitions have, of course, has very positive results, but right now it is really in a way degrading, I think, this in Brazil. Because, I mean, the discussions are not about how can we remodel that, so we just keep repeating the same model over and over again, somehow just reinforcing the idea that the architect who wins over everyone else. And I don't think that, let's say, in an 80 entry competition, all the 80 ones, only one is the best one. I mean, how can we rethink this model? How can we make it more democratic, let's say, or at least reduce the risks or costs involved in the process?
Tara?
One thing that I was surprised by with the Guggenheim competition, because I was, there with the jury deliberations, and it doesn't fully address your concern, although I certainly can relate. But I think a huge expense is often spent on rendering, and the jury really did not pay attention to rendering. They really paid attention to the architecture, and so I just would encourage people in the future participating. I mean, I think it depends on the jury and what the composition of the jury is. But if it's a serious jury, I would expect that they're focused on the actual, on the architecture, on that piece of it, and disregarding any, the flourishes that can be bought. It's one piece.
And when you look at a competition, often architects, and you're talking about specifically non-compensated competitions, right? Because compensated competitions are a different matter, though you're never compensated enough. Another way to look at it is ask yourself the question, if you're already measuring how much money you spend on a competition, you must also measure how much money you spend to market each project that you're going to do in your office. If you look at big corporations, their marketing budgets are enormous percentages of their annual overall cost of doing business. I'm not saying it should be for architects, but there is a way to measure your time and money against the potential of winning a commission and trying to evaluate whether or not those are good investments for you. It's not going to take the pain away entirely, but at least it rationalizes it somewhat.
I think the question is not quite the right question. I think the real question is, how do we sponsor research and development within our practices and achieve greater agency in the world? And competitions for me, and the culture of competitions for me, in many ways are an obstruction to that. Because similar to kind of typical client-based practice, it's us sitting around waiting for permission, right, to dream our dreams. And I'm all about dreaming, and I'm all about our agency. And so, there's a kind of standard thought that, yes, what makes the architect different from, let's say, an artist or someone else is that there's always someone else kind of giving them the constraints. But I don't know if we can continue that way and actually achieve the kind of greater goals that we have every day. So, there are resources out there now to help us do innovative work and thinking. There are grants, there aren't enough, right? But there are grant-giving organizations, there are exhibitions, there are galleries, there is publishing, there are research universities, there are resources, there are residencies, et cetera, that sponsor, that kind of work, right? And what's even better is that work will not be as heavily constrained by someone else's brief. And I think that's really important.
We've got another question over here, gentleman in the suit.
First, maybe just a full disclosure. I'm I'm D'Alessio, and I actually served on the Research Advisory Committee to RBD, so it was great to be part of that process. My question to Scott and to Gina and to Kara is to talk a bit about the role of mayors in the process, going through, Gina in particular, and some of the communities you worked in, and Scott, and the 2 states you work with, and Kara in Helsinki, and then the follow-up, Marshall. I was struck by your quote, "I'm not playing." Would you recommend mayors play or not? And if you do recommend mayors play, how would you recommend they should play?
Well, that counts as 4 questions. In order to try and give other folks a chance to ask questions, can I ask you guys to keep your responses relatively brief, in fact, very brief, because we're already running over just a bit. So if you could get bite-sized answers to that, that would be great. Thanks, those are great questions.
I mean, I would start just by saying that, and it kind of feeds back to one of the original questions you posed, Scott. Rebuild by Design was not just a competition for the designers. It was a competition for community members, and it was a competition for political officials, right? Mayors, et cetera. Everyone was competing. And so that was the interesting thing I thought with Rebuild by Design was not only were design teams asked to develop a project and kind of in a way, sell it to a political constituency. You also then had to have that political constituency adopt it and then advocate it and argue for it themselves. So, we had, it takes too long to talk about that process right now, but that was one of the very interesting and challenging things as part of Rebuild by Design.
Great, perfect. Scott?
I think it just depends on how concerned you are with having the outcome be implemented. If it involves the mayor's money and or the mayor's land, then you best get the mayor on board. Unless you're just interested in starting a conversation and having an ideas competition and going outside of that. And we tried to do both.
Kara?
Helsinki, half of our jury was politicians from Helsinki. That's my answer.
Marshall, different question.
The answer is no. I tell every politician in front of me, that I get a chance to not to do competitions, and I'll tell you the reason is why. Good design talent is not that hard to find, actually. Most of the top talents can be found in buildings just like this one, all around the country and around the world, right? It's really not that difficult to find the top, especially the top up-and-coming talent, if you just look in the right places, and the right places are obvious.
All right, one more question. If it's a really straightforward, simple one, yes.
We have all talked what competitions do. We have all talked about both yesterday and today about what competitions do for architects, but I'm concerned that we have not talked about either accountability, transparency, or the improvement of the public realm. And by this I mean whether the competitions are reinforcing a system of, let's call it, top-down practice, selecting by a sort of a kind of a jury, or whether the competitions are opening up a different kind of relevance of architecture vis-a-vis citizens and vis-a-vis political and democratic planning processes. And I'm just curious to see, these are institutional processes, Guggenheim, Rockefeller. I'm curious to know, probably closer to Marshall's concerns.
Marshall, you want to? That's a hard question for all 4 to answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer to that one.
To put it bluntly, are competitions in the last 10 years reinforcing or debilitating the sense of?
You come from a city where there's been a few of those in the last very few, but big ones. Do you think that those? I would turn it around. Do you think that those helped or hurt?
I come from Mexico City,
yeah.
but the last 10 competitions have been seen as debilitating the processes of
the airport was a debilitating process. What about Jose Vasconcelos Library?
You were a juror there, so I cannot comment on
Sure you can.
Total disaster.
But with the process.
You remember that in that jury, one of the other jurors walked out in disgrace saying that the choice was a disaster.
Yeah, I do remember.
So, and that kind of permeated, and it opened up the discussion of whether that system of decision-making in a process was positive or negative for democratic planning. Forget about the quality of the architecture. By no means, and I think it's evident that that building and that choice of the Vasconcelos Library by Kalach is the single most important building in Mexico done in the last 25 years. That's hands down.
I mean, there's clearly a friction between the idea of design competitions as being somehow capturing, let's say, visionary ideas, and the notion of, you know, so-called democratic, they're not all that democratic, but so-called democratic public planning processes. Yes, there's a friction, to be sure, because I think our motivations for doing those things is different, and often we're negotiating the transition from the competition, so you have the big vision, and then suddenly you have to get everyone to agree. I mean, actually, just before the Navy Pier project, there was a competition for another pier in St. Petersburg, Florida, where Michael Maltzin won, right? And then there was this fiasco which immediately followed it, where the public didn't want it. And in the end, they threw it out after, you know, a couple $1 million worth of work. So it's a problem.
It's a very interesting question, and the question was asked by one of Mexico's leading architects, and someone who I know is, but because of Mexican standards with international organizations, required to compete in competitions more often than an American architect, a U.S. architect, I should say, would be typically required to do. It's a great question. I think that question is going to underlie much of the rest of what we're going to be talking about today.
So this is where we are now. We're going to take a 10-minute, not a 15-minute, a 10-minute coffee break. We'll start in 10 minutes. Marshall, I want you to know that 3 of the Guggenheim finalists have already written back to you, and they're withdrawing from the competition. It's incredible. But seriously, please join me in thanking Marshall, Kara, Gina, Scott, and Reed. You did, I think, a terrific job of moderating, and thank you all very, very much for a stimulating morning.